Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something really exciting. We are dissecting a massive, high-stakes corporate rescue. We're going to step right inside a failing, multi-crore enterprise IT engagement for India's largest telecom tower company. We'll see exactly how it was pulled back from the absolute brink of termination and, believe it or not, transformed into a major strategic victory. This isn't just theory, folks. It's a literal masterclass in turnaround architecture. We're going to break down the exact numbers, the strategies, and the execution steps that actually made it happen. But before we dive into the crisis itself, let's establish the credibility of the architect behind this entire turnaround. We're looking at the strategic playbook of Arunava Chakravarty. He's an independent consultant who absolutely specializes in this kind of stuff: program recovery, building out project management offices, centers of excellence, and portfolio governance. His expertise is built on navigating really high compliance, incredibly complex environments across defense, government, and telecom sectors. So his specific niche, salvaging failing enterprise engagements and turning them into profitable, trust-based partnerships. And the case study we're digging into today is pretty much the ultimate proof of that. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. First, inheriting the storm. Second, the turnaround blueprint. Third, engineering the core recovery. Fourth, plugging the margin leaks. Fifth, the crown jewel renewal. And finally, turnaround leadership mindsets. Let's get right into it. Part 1, inheriting the storm. This is the month 18 crisis. Okay, so picture this. We are dropping right into the center of a burning building. It's month 18 of a 36-month managed IT services contract for, again, India's largest telecom tower company. The incumbent provider was exactly halfway through their contract, and the absolute starkest indicator of this total operational breakdown is this single terrifying metric: -6. Yeah, a -6. That is a completely hostile client net promoter score. In enterprise IT, a score like that means the trust deficit is so severe that termination isn't just a risk, it's actively being discussed at the executive table. The client was literally evaluating alternative partners at this point. And honestly, it makes total sense why that score was so low when you look at the deep financial pressure and operational breakdown. The vendor was basically hemorrhaging money. They were experiencing compounding losses, with SLA penalties escalating to over 6% of the monthly invoice value. Imagine losing that much every single month right off the top. And on top of that, vendor performance evaluation form, or VPEF, penalties were being slapped on separately. Operationally, it was a mess. They had critical S1 and S2 system failures happening because of massive level 3 skill gaps in network, Unix, and the security operations center. But you know what the worst part was? Zero innovation. Not a single change request had ever been raised. It was a purely reactive, stagnant, and heavily bleeding engagement. Moving on to part 2, the turnaround blueprint. This is the strategy for rescue. Now, you can't just put a Band-Aid on a crisis of this magnitude. To halt the bleeding, Arunava designed a highly intensive 6-month intervention based on an interlocking 3-gear system. Think of it like a finely tuned machine. First, you have the foundation, which is people. They had to replace underperforming level 3 engineers and inject some serious domain-wise training. Then, the engine, process, and governance. This meant establishing rigorous weekly SLA governance and deploying Zeef tracking to actually push back on client-side delays. Finally, the accelerator, technology and innovation. They deployed Zeef automation for ticket correlation and brought in tools like NextThings for proactive end-user experience management. It's a system where if one gear stops, the whole turnaround halts. They all have to move together. Part 3, engineering the core recovery. Time to get proactive. With the blueprint in motion, the focus immediately shifted to fixing the core. Because, let's be real, you can't win back client trust without fundamentally improving the day-to-day delivery. It's amazing to see the massive shift here from a reactive state to a proactive one. Just look at the domain-level engineering gauges. Windows patching compliance, it accelerated from 80% to 98% just through an Intune migration. Unix and Linux mean time to resolve improved from a sluggish 50% to an impressive 90%. And end-user support shot up from 40% to 90%, simply by moving away from reactive handling to proactive experience management. This is what fixing the core actually looks like in practice. It's deep, it's systemic, and it's totally engineering-led. All right, part 4, plugging the margin leaks. Let's talk financial viability. So fixing the technical metrics is awesome, but it's really only half the battle. If the account is still bleeding money, well, it's still a failure for the provider. The intervention had to fundamentally alter the financial viability of this multi-crore contract. Think of it like a leaky pipe. Historically, SLA breaches and VPEF penalties were draining over 6% of the monthly value, and it was just being paid out without contest. So, Arenova implemented what we can call a governance plug. This meant strict exclusion tracking and meticulously documenting any client dependency delays. By enforcing these strict protocols, they converted those reactive penalty payments into proactive penalty avoidance. They basically patched the hole and pushed that retained margin safely through. Let's put these numbers into perspective, because the measurable impact over the next 18 months was just phenomenal. Check this out. The SLA penalty rate plummeted from over 6% down to less than 1%. That alone is huge. But then look at client sentiment. That completely hostile score of -6, it swung to a highly positive +8. And remember how earlier we talked about zero innovation? Well, they ended up generating roughly 2 crores in change requests and executing them at an exceptional 80% gross margin. They quite literally took an account that was at severe risk of termination and completely flipped the script. Which brings us to part 5, the crown jewel renewal, the ultimate reward. When you fix the core and restore that relationship capital, you unlock the ultimate reward in enterprise IT. You secure the renewal. Now, normally for a distressed account of this size, the standard path at the end of the contract is a complete nightmare. It's an RFP maze, it's highly competitive, incredibly high risk, and frankly, just making the shortlist is usually the ceiling for an incumbent provider who's been failing. But because of this massive operational and relational turnaround, Arenova didn't have to navigate that maze. Instead, he built a direct bridge. And that operational turnaround culminated in a rare and highly coveted achievement. We're talking about a 20.6 crore 2-year extension that was awarded completely non-competitively. It was done via direct nomination, no RFP was ever issued, the competitors were just kept on standby. This decision came straight from the top, executed directly by the client CEO and CDI, and it was driven entirely by that restored relationship capital and the undeniable hard metrics of the recovery we just went through. Incredible, right? Finally, part 6, turnaround leadership mindsets, the strategic synthesis. So the big question is, how do you actually replicate this kind of success in your own engagements? Well, it really boils down to 3 core mindsets. Step 1, diagnose before reacting. You have to map the actual root causes, like those skill gaps and governance failures we talked about, rather than just blindly treating surface-level SLA symptoms. Step 2, win the relationship first. You need influence beyond your authority, and you get that through completely transparent escalation and brutally honest status reporting. And step 3, turn stability into growth. The absolute second the bleeding stops, you pivot the narrative. You go immediately from fixing problems to delivering innovation. Which brings us to the core takeaway of this entire explainer. As you look at your own distressed engagements or complex projects today, I really want you to ask yourself, are you just putting out fires, treating surface-level SLA symptoms and hoping for the best? Or are you doing the deep, systemic, diagnostic engineering required to transform a crisis into your very own direct bridge to renewal? Understanding that difference is exactly what separates a lost contract from a multi-core turnaround. Thanks so much for learning with us today.